It was just the worst experience I've ever had. I couldn't move. The man that was looking after me eventually sort of lifted me up off the floor.
Welcome everyone to the Mindset Podcast, where we explore the interchange between adversity and positive change. Paul, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you coming in. To start off, could you just tell us a bit about who you are and what you do, perhaps?
Okay. My name is Paul Henry. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a psychosynthesis practitioner, which is it's described as the fourth force, integrative therapy, and it's mind, body, spirit. So we're not just looking at the mind like CBT would look at the mind,
right?
But we're looking at the emotional impact of things and the journey of the soul. You know, the sort of spirit, which sounds a bit ethereal, but actually in the end most damage is done by that sort of wounding to the soul, which is quite often, you know, in childhood. I've been in practice as a therapist for 10 years.
Okay.
I changed my career. I was a filmmaker for 30 odd years, and I was working with an actor one day that I knew very well, hadn't seen for a while, and I said, you know, all actors, unless they're really fantastically successful or have a second business, his was knits. That was his knits. Yeah, so he'd go into schools and he'd sort out the kids' knit problem.
Oh, right, not as in knitting.
No, knits. And so I said, how's the knits business then? And he said, oh, no, I'm not doing that anymore, and I'm actually training to be a therapist. And by the end of that day, I'd been so seduced by that idea and thought, you know what, that is probably what I've been looking for. And so I signed up for a sort of a sampler, what they call an essentials weekend, and within 6 weeks I was training. So and I was able to do it alongside still making films.
Yeah.
I mean, by that time, I had at one point been working with, you know, very glamorous films, but over time that became less and less so.
Yeah.
You know, as the young folks came up behind me, and I would work with a minimum of 6 crew, and people were working with 2 crew, and whereas I'd been given brilliant scripts, or I would rewrite scripts, you know, drama scripts to be brilliant, I was no longer being asked to do that, and so the work had changed in a way where it was possible to be a lot more flexible. So I'd say, I trained once a month for a 4-day weekend.
Yeah.
And I'd say to the production company I was working with, I can't do Fridays and I can't do Mondays. And whereas once upon a time I would have thought they'd just say, well, you know, we can't use you then. Yeah. They'd say, oh, that's fine. I was amazed, you know, that it was possible to sort of boundary. And make it possible. So, I mean, that was almost like, you know, it was a gift.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah. And if we pause there, and that's almost like the good outcome, if you like, although life is such that it's not all good, and we rewind back to where you started, what, you know, childhood was like, and what got you into that film business. You can speak to that.
Okay. So I childhood was odd. I was an oddment. My parents, I would hear my parents say to their friends, he's a strange child.
Right.
And my parents wanted me to be one way.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was winning, even as in primary school, I was winning, you know, I mean, not that they were much, but they were art competitions, and I would win them all. And then in secondary school, you know, it was suggested that I go for a scholarship to Slade School of Art in London.
Right.
And I was just constantly told, you know, that's no good, you can't do that, you'll never make any money, you know, being an artist. and I was sort of driven down this other road of academia. Thankfully, I was very good at English, but that's kind of art anyway. But it sort of drove me away from my family. So I had a terrible relationship with my father. I didn't appreciate my mother, really. I mean, I look back now, actually, just sort of thinking about this makes me realise that I didn't really appreciate that my mother had my back. She sort of folded to my father's bullying, right. and I resented that. That she didn't stand up to him. I have a brother, pretty distant, really.
Right.
He sort of followed the family line, whereas I just knew that I had.
And what was the family line?
To be dull, to be all, just to kind of, I mean, actually, that's not strictly true. My father was quite a well-respected hairdresser, and then he became a lecturer in hairdressing. So that's an artistic.
Yeah, it's odd, isn't it?
But he just couldn't see it for me,
And what age did you flee the nest, and how did you find the courage to kind of do that, knowing that you, by the sounds of it, didn't have his blessing?
No, I didn't have his blessing. I was in a band when I was 16. He hated that. I went to art college, did fine art, had very long hair, and his college was right next to the art college, so I went to Brighton Art College in the end. He was at the technical college teaching hairdressing, and I can remember coming out of the art college one day and smoking outside the art college and seeing my father come out with his colleagues, and I remember one of his colleagues sort of pointing, and I can imagine him saying, "Is that your son?" Because I had hair down to my shoulders,
right.
And probably smoking weed, and he gave me such a telling off that night. And he said he was ashamed of me and all of that. And I just thought, right, that's it. I'm just going to have to get out of here. So he took me out of art college. Actually, I didn't get my degree.
Right.
And he spoke to a friend of his, and I went in. I did a crammed version of a hotel management course, which his mate said, "Oh, we'll put him in. We'll give him a crammer." And so I moved. Eventually, as soon as I could, I moved to London to work in the hotel business. And I know I've said to you before, my father said to me, here's £20. He gave me £20. He said, "You'll never amount to anything. Prove me wrong." So I came to London. Goodness knows how I coped. Because there was very little money, but I found somewhere to stay.
Yeah.
A really very basic place in Brixton, which I quite often go back and walk down Josephine Avenue, which was where this place was, and look at it and think, goodness, that's where my life in London started. And anyway, so I was in the hotel business. I hated it, absolutely hated it. I thought, right, I can't do this. I have to be working when I want to be out with my mates. People are rude. And I thought, I'll move into PR. I'll try and get into public relations in hotels. I had no idea what PR was, but it sounded like it was a 9-to-5 job, not working at weekends and all of that. And I met, I don't actually know how. At that point, I was working I was doing part-time work I was doing illustration work for a magazine called Oz, which was an underground magazine, and at the time it was in the Old Bailey. It'd been had up for obscenity, so it was in all the newspapers. And actually, I think that was probably anyway. As a result of it, Richard Neville, who was the sort of main editor, became editor of the Standard as a sort of guest editor of the Standard. I went for this interview at this hotel company. It was going really badly with this awful, sort of very straight marketing man,
right?
And I can't remember quite how. I think I saw the Standard, and it was maybe Richard Neville's name was there. And I said, actually, I do some work with Richard Neville. I work on Oz magazine. And he said, really? Oh, that's... Well, I had lunch with Richard Neville yesterday, and just purely through that, I was offered a job in the public relations department.
Which is really interesting, because when you look at... there's lots there that's interesting, as well as, the stuff around what your dad had said to you and everything else. I'm fortunate enough to know you anyway, and we've spoken before, and it's amazing how untrue what he said is, and it sounds like you exercised extreme courage, because like you say, you went down to London with not a lot of money, and then also just the power of connection with other people. And the business world, we call it networking, of course, or take it a step further, and it's business development. But in any walk of life, how connecting with other people and just connecting over the right things can present so much opportunity. So you made that segue into doing that, and then if you fast forward, you ended up how did you end up going from that into the film? And I think you did some stuff in music as well, maybe.
Yeah, well, when I got to it was Grand Metropolitan Hotels, which doesn't exist anymore, but they had 52 hotels. The brochures are just awful. So I suggested maybe I could get involved with redesigning the brochures, and that got me into... I had to sort of do a crash course in graphics, and I started going around the hotels, photographing them, and doing new brochures, and that was all going very well, and I really enjoyed it. And one of the people I was dealing with, who did posters and signage and things like that for the hotels, I was talking to him one day, and he had some some music posters in his car, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Do you work for record companies?" And anyway, he did, and I said, "Look, that's actually my first love is music. I absolutely love music. If you ever hear of any of the record companies, needing someone in the art department, I'd really love, a shot at it." Anyway, right. Not so long afterwards, he called me and said, "Actually, United Artists need someone in their art department, and the marketing manager is a really good friend of mine. He says he'll see you." And
isn't that remarkable that this guy you didn't know?
Yeah, well, I knew him a bit,
right?
But yeah, not well, and it was it's one of those things that people are good.
Yeah,
people are good.
Yeah,
so
and also being yourself is quite important.
Yeah,
because I suspect there was a connection there because you were yourself with him.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I met him actually. He was 88 recently, and I met him to thank him.
Right, that's really...
I haven't seen him for like 40 years or something. 50
years.
40 years. Anyway, so I was offered the job. I was absolutely hopeless. I mean, I was so square.
Mm.
I had all my clothes were wrong, and I just remember, I'm not going to last 5 minutes here. Everyone drinks, takes drugs, smokes. Wears trendy clothes. I've got none of that, and I thought, well, I'll just buy a packet of cigarettes and just hold a cigarette, in the meetings, so it looks like I'm one of them.
Yeah.
And by the end of a month or so, I was buying a packet of cigarettes every day, smoking them all. I swore I'd never go to the wine bar. Everyone went to the wine bar at lunchtime, and within a few months, I was going to the wine bar. Not only at lunchtime, but in the evening, and I was began that sort of steady decline. But it was a fabulous time. I was so lucky. I came into the music business just when punk and new wave was breaking.
Right.
So I worked with Dr. Feelgood, the Stranglers, the Buzzcocks, Sex Pistols, and then. By contrast, I was working with Bing Crosby, Rosemary Clooney. So it was a real sort of contrast but it was a great experience. I was doing record covers. The Stranglers record covers were very successful. They won awards, and then I went from record company to record company doing that. I worked with U2, Simple Minds, Marianne Faithfull, who who died recently, sadly. Traffic, Bob Marley. So eventually I ended up at Island Records. I was the man I'd worked with at United Artists Records, who was the managing director, had left United Artists, gone into Island Records. I mean, Island Records was so sort of elite.
Yes.
And he was the wrong man, really, to be running it. And he called me one day and said, "Look, I need an ally here.
Right.
Would you be interested in coming and being the art director?" And I thought, I've done art direction and record covers for such a long time now. I'm not really interested in doing that. So I said, "Well, okay, but I want to be marketing director. And,
Right.
I want to look after the marketing, so it's a wider brief than just record covers. But I also want the art department." And he said, "Okay, I can do that." And then I thought, you know what? I don't know. I don't want that. And I called him and I said, "Look, I don't think I want to do this."
Right.
And he said, "Name your price." Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And that was that. So.
And what era? So what era was that of
That
Island
was
Records?
1979. I think 1979, something like that. So we just signed U2. We just let Ultravox go.
Right.
I can remember being in a meeting and saying, "Look, this band will make it. They will make it." And they said, "No, we've spent a lot of money. We're going to let them go." And they immediately went to Chrysalis Records, released Vienna, which was a #1 hit right round the world.
Oh wow.
And yeah.
And the rest is history.
And then we had the same argument about U2 as well. They wanted to drop U2.
Right.
And thankfully I said, "Look, let's just hang on to them." And, of
And
course,
what was the experience with Bob Marley and
so then so then one of the issues was because Chris Blackwell was a white Jamaican. He was very, very keen to offset his, I don't know whether it was guilt. I mean, he's genuinely into reggae music and Jamaican music, but he would just insist on spending lots of money on the reggae acts, and I thought, well, that's fine, but we need to try and cross some of them over because it was such a narrow market, the reggae market. So I took it upon myself to, I think it was Steel Pulse or one of these bands that we had, to suggest that we didn't use the red, green and gold signature, which is the reggae sort of signature, and try and cross it over into the mainstream.
Right.
And he was really angry.
Right.
And he said, "You need to come to Jamaica." I'd actually spent a lot of time in Jamaica already with other bands, but I thought, okay, that'd be good. Nice trip to Jamaica.
Yeah.
And so I spent a couple of weeks there, and during that time I was working with Bob Marley. Saw Bob Marley a number of times. Went up to his house and I had a very hard time there because I knew that weed was not good for me. It really had a bad effect on me, weed, especially the sort of Sansimilia, the weed that they they grew there. And so on this one occasion I was at Bob's, and he handed me this big fat doobie, and I said, "No, it doesn't really agree with me." He said, "Come on, man, you've got to smoke the weed," and it was just the worst experience I've ever had. I mean, it was loaded with cocaine, heroin.
Oh wow!
It was just had everything in it, and I couldn't move. And the man that was looking after me eventually sort of lifted me up off the floor and poured me back into his car, and I was taken back to Kingston, to my hotel, and on the way back we were shot at.
You were shot at?
The car was shot at.
Okay, so you're sat with Bob Marley?
No, I wasn't with Bob Marley.
Oh, okay,
no.
Not at that point.
No. But it was very turbulent, Kingston.
It was at that era, yeah. So that was that the era just before the what would have been a civil war, but for the
I can't remember when. I mean, certainly there was a lot of unrest.
Yeah.
Cars were on fire.
Wow.
Bullets were flying all over the place.
and that experience. I mean, everything you've just said there, and to an extent, you know, I could listen to those stories all day, but all of that, you know, to an extent, to me and to people listening, may sound like, you know, a bit of a rock and roll time. Lots of big names, name your price. You know, you've kind of really found you know, you're in the upper echelon at that time. You're really in the thick of it. And what was actually happening with you and the culture and everything else?
At that point, when I went to Island Records, I remember I was offered my first line of cocaine, and I can remember thinking, okay, I've been avoiding that, but then I thought, no, that's actually okay. But of course, you know, there is that sort of downward slide. So alcohol levels out cocaine levels out alcohol, and over a period of time, it went from being fantastically good fun. And you know, mixing with lots of bands, to being a massive problem. You know, I ended up drinking round the clock, smoking crack. I didn't quite get into heroin, but you know, I was really on the edges of it, and everything started to sort of fall apart, really. But I mean, the big problem was that people would just say, well, you know, he's artistic.
Yeah.
So turning up pissed was not a problem.
Yeah.
You know, because they'd just say, well, you know, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And I was still able to work, but I just became more and more desperate as a person, you know, and more lonely and isolated. And so I mean, there were great experiences, lots of very fun times, but in between, you know, there were these sort of, you know, really sort of desperate times. Yeah, it was a great anyway. So eventually, Island Records ended with me bringing over a band called Kid Crail and the Coconuts, and they were an 18-piece band or 16-piece band, very expensive to bring over to London. And I did a marketing campaign where we didn't mention who they were, just put these amazing posters up everywhere because they looked so amazing. And Chris Blackwell came into London, saw the posters, and the first thing he said was, "Why doesn't it say who they are?" And of course the plan was to put a poster up where every poster was. We'd put another poster the next week saying Kid Crail and the Coconuts, Tropical Gangsters, album out now, and you know. But anyway, he just got really upset, and we'd had lots of problems, he and I, anyway, and he sacked me. So that was the end of that.
And at that point, how would you say, you know, how do you deal with everything that's going on in terms of feeling like, I assume you found some relative success because you've gone from being really sought after, working in these big names, and then that ending and you being sacked. How do you then pick yourself back up and move forward?
Do you know, I can't remember how I felt. I think I was okay, actually. I thought, okay, that, you know, I'll just go back to freelancing.
Right.
Someone approached me. I'd actually made a film with Iggy Pop in the interim, and it had been very successful. And someone had seen that, a producer had seen it, and a few weeks after I'd left Island Records, he approached me and said, "Do you fancy, you know, making films with me?" And I said, "Okay, I don't know much about it." He said, "That's fine, you know, don't worry about that. We'll figure it out." Because then, when you were making music videos, you just had to come up with great images.
Yeah.
You know? And the sort of narrative technique of being able to tell a story was less important. So I picked it up very quickly. The Kid Crail marketing campaign, which I'd booked and was unchangeable, won marketing campaign of the year. The album went to #1. They had 3 #1 singles.
Wow.
And Chris Blackwell actually did phone me and say, "Brilliant job. Sorry, you know, you're not. I didn't trust you, and we'll send you the award." And I said, "Oh, well, that's great, thank you." And of course, it never arrived.
Out of interest, how did that make you feel at the time, winning one marketing campaign of the year? bearing in mind that when you left home, the comments that were made.
I see. I mean, I was always full of doubt, so it didn't really help terribly. I was never really convinced. Even all the wins didn't really, never really convinced.
Never really amounted to anything.
No, and so the first films that I made were with Marianne Faithfull, which she was an absolute legend at that point, and that was really helpful. And I worked with Kate Bush, and U2, and then an advertising agency saw the Kate Bush films and contacted us and said, would you be interested in doing some commercials? And I can remember thinking, no, I don't want to do commercials. But we were never making any money. Every time we made a music video, we lost money. We just couldn't make money because we always spent all the money on the film. And it was always shot 35mm, and it was, expensive, like making a movie. Anyway, we had this producer, this film, old school film producer that we brought in, who said he'd just go to the agencies and see if anyone was interested. And he'd brought these scripts in, and he said, "I've got these scripts," and I looked at them and said, "Yeah, that's quite interesting." He said, "Well, I'm going to do I'll do a budget for them." And I said, "Okay." I was really not interested really, but then and then he showed me the budget, and there was this figure at the bottom of the budget. And I said, "What's this figure?" And he said, "Well, that's the profit." I said, "Right, okay, let's start making commercials." So we started making commercials, and that sort of led into another area.
Right.
I never really quite cracked the commercials market, but that then led into drama-based sort of corporate films, training films and things like that, which was great. Car launches, with big budgets and what have you.
And when you look back at that period of time, everything you've just explained, and you may not have spent significant time reflecting on this, but is there anything there that you think that you had about you or your approach that really contributed towards that success? Because whether or not you've spent time reflecting on the objective success you had, I don't know, but there's clearly a lot of objective success there. Forget about the financial elements of some of it along the way. Do you think there's any particular skill sets that you possessed or any particular approach that you used in order to be able to excel? Or do you think it just came back to you being Paul Henry, the authentic person who had a passion for something?
I just thought I was incredibly lucky.
Right. Do you still think that, though?
No, I can see it differently now. I mean, one of the producers I work with, I met up with again recently, and he was saying some lovely things. And in the end, I won over 100 film awards.
Right.
So I mean, the work was obviously, the work was good, but of course I was also rapidly declining, and turning up for. Well, I was very confused. I was getting very confused, so I'd turn up for what I thought would be a meeting with one other person, and I'd be pissed, and the doors of this boardroom would open, and there'd be like 20 people sitting around a table, and I was expected to do a presentation. I couldn't even string 2 words together, and I'd be sort of escorted out of the room, sent home in a taxi with a letter saying, presumably we presume that you wouldn't normally come to work like this, so we'd like you to continue. It was just like, I was very lucky, because I would have expected that to be the end. In fact, I can remember thinking, what has got to happen for me to actually realise that I've got to do something about this, because I was just completely out of control.
So what was the beginning of the end?
Well, it was people saying, "Have you been drinking?" Those sort of comments. I was quite heavily into crack by then, and it was costing a lot of money, so I had to stop doing that. And as soon as I stopped smoking crack, the alcoholism just became completely uncontrollable, 24-hour drinking and so on. And And a very old friend of mine, someone that was also a record sleeve designer, that we'd worked together, he took over doing the Stranglers artwork after I left. He went into the Priory to get sober. He was my drinking buddy. And so we'd go out drinking 4 or 5 times a week together. And he phoned me. I phoned him one day, and he wasn't there. And then he called me. His wife had called him at the Priory and said, Paul's phone. And he called me, and I said, "Where are you?" He said, "I'm in the Priory." I said, "What are you doing in the Priory?" He said, "Oh, I'm getting sober." I didn't speak to him for 4 years after that. This is a man I spoke to every day, almost 4 years. But when I hit the buffers, he was the person I called, and his life was all sorted out by then because he was in recovery. And
so what happened at the end, and how did you start your, because this is really kind of important for anyone experiencing any adversity, is how do you get to the point where you accept what's in front of us, and then how do we move forward to what's on the horizon for us?
Hope, I think, I think that's what turned everything round. I mean, and kindness. He was kind. He took me to meetings. In that second meeting I went to, I just thought, yeah, maybe I can stop. And he left me in that second meeting. I think he actually left me in the first meeting as well. So I had to speak to other people. And someone was just very kind and made me think, maybe it would be okay. And so I just went to meetings. I was willing.
And how did you manage to accept the fact that you had a problem?
I knew long before I went to my first meeting I had a problem.
Right.
I was willing to do absolutely anything to stop. And as long as I was able to not drink, that would be enough,
So the desperation took you to a place where you were willing enough to really make a change.
Yeah. But of course it's been so much more than that. It's been a wonderful, sort of spiritual journey, and it's given me a completely new life. It was 28 years ago that I stopped drinking.
And how do you feel that you were as an individual before versus now in they're very different careers.
Yeah.
But in terms of, managing or to frame it another way, what do you think you were medicating before, which you're doing differently now? What was the, for me it's stress and anxiety, fear. And then overwhelming, right? Fear.
Yeah, fear. It was always fear. I mean, and when I look back at the film business, it is an extraordinary business in as much as you're asking all of these not necessarily responsible people to come together in one place, all of them, because you need them all, to work for a day or two together, to all turn up and be ready to do the job with the right equipment. And very often that wouldn't happen. The art department would get it wrong, or one day I can remember I had a massive shoot with Roger Daltrey, and the lighting truck turned up, having driven right across London, and we opened up the back doors and there was nothing in it.
No.
Yeah. So I mean, all of those things they were real problems, and I was always very fearful, and I was always thinking, whatever happens, if something goes wrong, it'll be my fault. I will get the blame. And of course, I very rarely did get the blame when things went wrong. But I was always, thinking it would be, that I would get the blame. I would fail.
And how I'm just intrigued to know how because fear is something we all experience, of course, in day-to-day life and in career and everything else. How do you think you overcame the fear to enable yourself to, again, achieve what you achieved?
Well, I think, being sober was a big part of that. And I can remember in early days in recovery, a man called Robert Nelson. I don't know if you ever met Robert Nelson. He was a Scotsman, very lovely Scotsman, and he used to say, when fear comes knocking at the door and faith answers, there's no one there. And he really taught me about faith and believing things will be okay. And I loved that idea that also that acronym about fear being false evidence appearing real. And I began to realize that actually fear is very often about things that aren't real. I remember one of my early my first sponsor, I went and saw him quite regularly, and he would say, or rather, he said to me one day, how was that issue that you were talking about? And I said, what was it? He said, well, you were talking about this disaster that was about to happen. And I said, no, that didn't happen. And he said, do you know what? Most of the disasters you've ever brought to me haven't happened.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that was very helpful to realise that, I see sort of catastrophe, or saw catastrophe in everything, really.
And do you think that's helped clear the way a bit more for your kind of second career in life?
Well, in sobriety, I've buried both my parents. I've had a daughter who's had all sorts of problems, mental health problems, and I've retrained. Yeah, and I've retrained to go into a new career, which in many ways is quite artistic in its own way. I think psychosynthesis there's a lot of imagination involved in it, and yeah, certainly having faith and having a program and being able to sort of get up in the morning and pray for a sober day, do a bit of meditation. And then at the end of the day, write a list of things I'm grateful for, and reflect on if I've hurt anyone or whether I need to make any kind of amend. That's been a very useful day-by-day process to deal with all the fears around having to succeed. Having to write papers that would be marked as successful, and all of those things. And it's an interesting thing that as a person, I think I've always been very shy and retiring, although I've put myself in places where you're judged. If you make a piece of artwork, especially a record cover, that is going to be judged without any question. If you write advertisements or make films, they will all be judged. Everything will be judged. And for someone that actually is shy and retiring, it's it's perverse, really. That might be. But I suppose in a way that was part of the journey to try and feel better about myself.
And when you look back at that period of your life, especially when you're in that declining period, and that kind of juxtaposition of huge success but hugely declining, is there a single sort of biggest lesson that you learnt about yourself or life during that period that you keep with you now?
I think everything will be okay. There's a line in a film, I think it's called The Marigold Hotel or something like that, and it says everything will be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end. And it's as corny as can be, but I think that's absolutely what I believe. Things will always be okay. People are good, and things generally will work out. Now that works for me. I'm sure that's not working for people in Gaza or in any war-torn area of the world. So it makes faith and belief a very sort of personal. Very personal thing, but for me, that's the truth of it. That people are generally good, helpful. Things work out. Collaboration is fabulous. I love that thing of collaboration. So now I only collaborate with a client. But we with each client we create something individual, which will be completely different to the next client that comes in.
And what would you say is one thing that people misunderstand about you the most?
I think people think, when I was making films and it was all not going very well, I'd be standing there in a looking calm, panicking like mad, and people would come over and say, "Gosh, Paul, you're so calm." And I'd be absolutely screaming inside. So I think that's something that I've always had, is the ability to look as if, I know what I'm doing, and things are going okay. So I think that's something. I think people see me differently to how I see me.
It's interesting, the calm thing, because I think most people, you know, I like that concept of we're all just kind of making it up, or we're all just winging it, or we're all trying, you know, because we forget that everyone else is in the same boat, you know, and we think that the only one's experiencing certain things. So I'm mindful just of time, just in to close. 2 questions. One, and one I'll pre-qualify and say you don't have to answer if you don't feel comfortable. One, what would you say to your younger self if you met him now?
Have faith. I think that would be it. Just have faith that, you know, everything will work out. Just have faith in yourself.
And both your parents have now passed.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were sat in a room with your dad today, and you had the opportunity to readdress what he had said to you before you left, having gone through everything you've gone through, what do you think you'd say to him?
Oh, I don't know what I'd say to him. Yeah, it's difficult to know, really.
Do you feel like you've achieved? Do you feel like
I know a lot more about him now. He was the 11th of 12 children, so he would have got very little guidance from his father. And I don't suppose he was well qualified to know how to be a father.
Do you think you're able to look back on your experiences and have some peace around the fact that you've achieved?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I sometimes, think actually I've done okay.
Because what is achievement, right, and what is success? And actually,
I'm peaceful.
Well, I was about to say, listening to you, you know, you've gone through a huge amount. You're still here. You've retrained and you're doing something you love, where you're helping improve people's lives. Even in your darker times, you still achieved a lot through being yourself and being authentic and genuine. And your life's completely changed and you've got some peace. So by all accounts, it sounds like a pretty successful life to me. Yeah.
No, I think I wouldn't change any of it, I don't think. If I had it over again. Because there've been so many, you know, extraordinary moments.
Yeah.
You know, ones that stick out. Some awards that some films I made that should have won awards that didn't, and me feeling so angry about it. Other films that I'd never imagined in 100 years would do anything, won awards, and you know, and just being, you know, confused about that. Brilliant people I've worked with. I can remember. I can remember working with a man called Conrad Hall, who lit Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, American Beauty,
right.
You know, films like that. And we were working in Canada, and it was a horrendous experience. I'd say to him, "Okay, I see the shot here," and he'd go, "Yeah, the shot's here." He just, everything I said to him,
was a complete contradiction.
Yeah, he could contradict everything. It was 5 days of hell,
right?
But he lit it brilliantly. You know, he just used so little light.
Right.
And he was a master. You know, but he was a bastard as well. There's just endless stories.
Yeah,
Iggy Pop, Marianne Faithfull, Bob.
It sounds like it's a pretty incredible life. To be honest, that's what it sounds like from being sat here. But with that, we'll close. But thanks a lot for coming. I really, really, really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.
Thanks.